Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Well, Canada enters 2022 still in the throes of COVID restrictions, with inflation growing and continuing supply chain challenges. Here to talk about Canada's circumstances is Randy Hoback. He is a member of Parliament for Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and the Shadow Minister Critic for International Trade and Supply Chain Resilience. Welcome to the show, Randy.
Oh, it's great to be here, Tony. A happy New Year to you. It's nice to be part of 2022.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to start broadly, and I'd love to get your assessment of Canada's economic risks going into this year. What are you worried about?
Yeah, where do you start, Tony? Inflation, I think, tops the list right now as people are watching inflation and what that may do to interest rates and just the cost of everything's going up and how much more it's costing to buy groceries or just their everyday goods. So that's definitely one of the items that, is definitely on the radar on a macro sense. And then, of course, on the trade side, we're looking at supply chains and how chains are being redeveloped and readapted and, where Canada fits in this redevelopment of these new supply chains and what are some of our strategic partners are doing without us. That's definitely some concerns that we have. And then, let's just look at the basics of COVID and what's going around there and this latest outbreak. That's creating all sorts of labor issues and labor shortage issues and in debates about whether, for example, vaccinated or unvaccinated truckers should be allowed to cross the border, things like that. So there's lots of things to deal with now when we go back to Ottawa.
Yeah, it seems like it's all happening at once, for sure. With inflation, I know you mentioned that right off the top. What does that mean for the average Canadian?
Well, we're starting to hear some big dollars. Like if your grocery bill is going to go up another $1,000 this year, if your gas goes up another $500 this year, if your heating bill goes up another $500 this year, you can already start to see you're getting $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 more in costs that are starting to hit your bottom line. Those are after-tax dollars that you're spending that are going out the door to do the basic necessities of life here in Canada. So people are starting to feel a pinch and they're starting to worry about just exactly how they're going to be able to afford different items moving forward.
You mentioned the trucking situation. That's probably something that most Canadians aren't even aware of as an issue. Could you just unpack that for our audience a little bit?
Yeah, right now we've got a situation where we've got a number of unvaccinated truckers that are hauling essential services goods, fruits and vegetables, things like that across that border. We right now have a shortage in supply of truck drivers. And here in the end of January, we're actually shutting that border to unvaccinated truck drivers. So we're asking the government to just hold off on that, to stick to testing and rapid testing and still making sure that people are doing everything they can to keep a safe work environment. But in this situation, allow those truckers to move back and forth because we need those goods. We need to have those grocery stores full of vegetables. We need to get those parts for our plants. And if we take that percentage of truckers off the road, it's just going to make the supply situation that much worse.
And just to be accurate, this isn't something the United States is demanding, right? It's a Canadian federal government requirement.
Yeah, it's the Canadian side right now. It's goods coming into Canada. So if we decide that we're not going to let those drivers in, that creates the problem here in Canada, not in the U.S. So it's definitely a Canadian issue right now.
Obviously, you are in charge as part of your critic responsibilities of assessing Canada's supply chain resilience. What conclusions have you come to so far?
It's very interesting, Tony. Everybody thinks the supply chain problems just started to happen because of COVID, but they were starting to show signs of problems pre-COVID. We're seeing situations in our ports where they haven't been modernized. We didn't see our rail networks upgraded, our ports upgraded. We're starting to see backlogs and shippings. We're starting to see things like, I use example here in Prince Albert, we have lots of truckers that haul logs and wood and stuff like that. Just a simple air valve, normally the dealer stock 5 of them. All of a sudden they had to order one out of Toronto for a neighbor of mine. We're seeing those types of situations that every sector is impacted. So what's happened, I think, is we've seen a lot of businesses in their race to be efficient and competitive. And in Canada, it costs more to do things than it does in other parts of the world. Looking at outsourcing things more and more all the time. And then as soon as you get a glitch in your transportation network, well, then you have a glitch in your manufacturing network and it just trickles right through the whole system. So I think that's where we see the U.S. being very, very active, and they've been active since Donald Trump years in reshoring businesses back into the U.S., especially essential businesses, making sure that they have those key elements, those key goods always available in the U.S. And that's something that we haven't even touched upon here in Canada.
We're speaking with Randy Hoback. He is a member of Parliament for Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. He is a shadow minister critic for international trade as well as supply chain resiliency. We are going to continue this discussion after the break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Randy Hoback. He is a member of Parliament for Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, shadow minister as well for international trade and supply chain resiliency. Randy, we're talking about supply chain now, and you've identified some things that have been structurally, I guess, creeping up on us over the years. It's not just a COVID issue, but of course, COVID has made things worse as well. Is that your assessment?
Yeah, definitely COVID did add to the problems. Don't get me wrong. It is playing a part of it. When you start seeing facilities being shut down because of COVID outbreak in their facilities, it has a trickle down or a domino effect throughout that whole chain. And, I use the auto sector, for example. If you have one facility go down, you look at the number of facilities that feed into a plant that's actually putting together the cars. One item missing, and a good example is microchips in cars right now.
Right.
It just stops everything. And, example with the microchip issue, there's 1 million less cars built in Canada last year than the year before because of one breakdown in the chain in regards to a supply of a component, in this case, microchips.
1 million fewer cars assembled in Canada because of these supply chain issues.
That's right. That's the CME's telling me those numbers. And they don't think they're going to come back relatively quickly. And that's why you see companies, or countries like the U.S. doing exactly what they need to do to take care of American interests. So they're reshoring those chip manufacturers back into the U.S. For example, there's a huge announcement, I think it was an $8 billion investment that Samsung is doing in Texas, making microchips.
Right.
Those types of investments are being made because the U.S. recognizes the importance of having them onshore. And of course, when you look at that scenario, Canada wasn't even in the running. We were even talked about, we were even considered as a possible location to put that facility. That's more than our total investment in the manufacturing sector the last year in one facility in the U.S. And we see this over and over again in the U.S. where they've taken on companies that have gone abroad and realized, hey, no, that didn't work. We need to get you back in the U.S. And they've had an active campaign in doing that and been very successful in doing that. And we're just not part of that game at all.
Let's talk a little bit about our reliance on the Chinese supply chain. Is that something you're concerned about as well?
Well, you always get concerned. We have to do business with China. Let's be pragmatic. That's not going to change. We want to make sure it's good business and fair business. And I have to say, under the Harper government, we had good business and fairly fair business. But we also had respect amongst our leaders. They respected Harper, and he respected them for the most part. So there was a fair exchange in goods and values. And you also have to remember, under the Harper government, we spent a lot of money on the Western Gateway, so in the Pacific Coast, in Vancouver, in the rail network, making it more efficient. That's all stopped under the Liberal government, and that needs to restart. If you look at our facilities, if we look at the next generation of ships and what's coming down the line, we can't handle them. The new big container ships, the new types of fuels they'll be running, none of our ports have been upgraded to handle any of that stuff. And, that's not even been talked about in this government, and they need to be proactive instead of reactive on things such as this. We need trains that run when it's minus 40 and when it's plus 50. We need boats that can be loaded, unloaded, whether it's raining or shining. And we need highways that run 24 hours a day, whether it rains out or not rains out. Those are things that are musts for Canada. So we have to make sure we've got the infrastructure in place to do that. And as we see more and more talk on climate change and more events like we've seen in British Columbia, it just reiterates the fact we have to spend more and more money to get those infrastructure pieces right and in place.
Yeah, and you can't just snap your fingers. One of these container ships, it takes a good couple of years to get it, commissioned and actually working, right? So these are long-term issues we're facing.
That's right. Again, you need a proactive lens on this, and you need to look at where the industry is going and making sure our ports are in line with where the industry is going so that we can actually do the business. We've got more free trade agreements than any other country in the world, but if we can't get our goods to market, what good are they? And right now, that is a huge problem. We're not known as a reliable shipper. We're not known as somebody that's bankable and dependable in a just-in-time delivery mechanism coming out of Canada. So we need to look at what we need to do to change that. And that requires a substantial amount of investment. But it's investment that would be well worth our case, or well worth our cause, and would have paybacks for Canadians in the long term, for sure.
And is that one of the things you're calling on the federal government to do, to actively have more investment in infrastructure in these areas?
I don't think they're going to have a choice. They have to do it. We've seen what happened out in British Columbia this fall or this winter. We can't have a repeat of that. And it's not just British Columbia. It can happen on the East Coast. It can happen out of the Port of Montreal. There can be different environmental events that can impact. Regardless of environmental events, you've got these new types of ships coming into play into the system. We have to make sure our ports can actually accommodate them, can actually take them in and refuel them and service them and do the work that needs to be done before they're loaded and continue on their way. We have to become container friendly, and we just haven't done a good enough job in doing that or being prepared to do it into the future. And that comes back to the business with China. We always will be doing business in Asia, whether it's China, Japan,
right.
The Asian countries. We're talking about a trade agreement there right now.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Randy Hoback. He is the Member of Parliament for Prince Albert and also Shadow Minister Critic for International Trade and Supply Chain Resiliency. Randy, you're making a good point there, and I had to cut you off. Please continue.
Well, I just looked at this last situation this last year. If we would have had our ports in shape, if we would have had the ability to handle the capacity, when we've seen the U.S. ports just get basically overloaded with goods, and some stupid regulatory problems that are facing down in California, for example, we had an opportunity to take on that traffic,
right,
but we weren't prepared to handle it. We couldn't take it on, and we lost a huge opportunity there, which is unfortunate. In fact, the Americans started paying ships to go through the Panama Canal and come up into New Orleans and into Florida just because they couldn't handle it on the West Coast.
Incredible. Well, let's talk about critical minerals, another important area where Canada should be a player. These are things that are used on everything like electric vehicle batteries or solar panels, those kinds of things, as well as your own smartphone. So this is an area that I know we're concerned about the supply chain for that too. Could you give us your perspective on it?
Yeah, it's one of those items that right now a lot of the critical elements are either coming out of Africa or basically, amassed in China, and then we're buying them all out of China. We've got all those elements in Canada, and the Liberal government recognized that. In fact, they talked about that as we've seen the scare at the electric vehicles, possibly the new Buy Back Better program that was coming, that defeated in the U.S., but was coming into place, which would have relocated all our EV future production into the U.S. Critical elements was the tool that we're using to say, well, wait a minute, we may want to stay in Canada because we've got all those critical elements. But we have some big problems there right now. One is we don't have a favorable regulatory environment for a mining company to go out and extract those elements. So, the same regulations that we used to shut down the oil and gas sector, now the critical element people are facing those exact same regulations and saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm not going to spend $1 billion going through a resource development project, doing all my environmental assessment and consulting, which they don't have a problem doing. But it's the duty it's the government's decision at the end. It's that unpredictability, unbankability of that process that just say, no, we're not going to do it. And that is a problem that we face here in Canada with this government and some of the legislation they brought in the previous government when they were in their previous session of Parliament, Bill 68 and 69. So when you look at that, you're saying, okay, we've got all these elements sitting here. Not only do we want to extract them, we actually want to process them here. We want to make sure we're making the batteries and making the components that go around the batteries and everything else here in Canada. We want that chain to actually be here. That requires a strategy. And I don't see a strategy coming out of this government. There's just nothing there. So if we want to move to electric vehicles, we've got lots of things to consider. Our power grid, that's one big consideration. Now, you guys got really cold weather in Ontario this week, so I imagine you're getting taxed to the nth degree on the power grid right now. Let's throw another 100,000, 200,000 electric cars in there. So we have to make sure we can handle that. But then let's look at the critical elements. Okay, we need to make sure we can get batteries. And then we can't have batteries all of a sudden show up and then not show up and have a car sitting there waiting for a battery to come out of China. That's not acceptable. So we have to make sure we can be self-sufficient in that. And it doesn't mean it always has to be in Canada, but it has to be in a situation where we have a partner that we can trust to always reliably deliver it to us. And, so the U.S. or maybe some of our partners in Europe could be another alternative for sure, or partnering with them as we extract the elements to take advantage of the marketplaces. I just see so many opportunities around the critical elements side of things that we just need to have a proper strategy to make sure we take advantage of all those opportunities and not just be a person or a country where we extract it and ship it all away again and let Taiwan ship it back to us.
Sure. Yeah, and you referenced the U.S. and I've noticed that President Biden has done a number of executive orders on supply chain, including critical minerals, semiconductors. You mentioned PPE. It seems like there's a whole new strategy out of the U.S. when it comes to supply chain. Are you getting that sense out of Ottawa at all with the Liberal government?
No, in fact, the Minister of Transport was just talking about maybe starting a study on it and doing some consulting on it here in the new year, probably 4 years too late. So we're going to study it while they're acting on it. We're going to look at it while they're actually capitalizing and taking advantage of opportunities that exist right now. A lot of companies have been re-looking at their distribution and their supply networks and saying, do I want to be that reliant on one country or one area? So how do I diversify that? So you want to go to like-minded countries. You want to go to democracies that you trust and respect and that have a bankability in their supply chain. So I always know I can get those goods, whether it's PPEs or whether it's chips or microchips or anything like that. And, Canada would be a great place to locate a lot of those facilities, but we just don't have the environment to do that. We don't have a competitive structure. We don't have a taxation structure. We don't have a government that understands business. And, because of that, they're locating in other parts of the world, and Canada's not part of that thought process.
We're going to continue our conversation with Randy Hoback, MP for Prince Albert, and talking about supply chain. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. We're here with Randy Hoback. He is a member of Parliament for Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, as well as Shadow Minister Critic for International Trade and Supply Chain Resilience. Randy, in the few minutes we've got left, I know you're an expert on Canada-U.S. trade relations. Over the years, you've made many deputations to Washington, D.C. What is the state of that relationship right now?
Well, it needs some work. There's no question about it. You think about it, during COVID, we were actually 2 years where we didn't have a presence in the U.S. other than our ambassadors and the people that were located in Washington. And they're good people, but it's not the same political relationship that you have with parliamentarians. And what I've seen when I was down there in December with Minister Ng was basically a government that was all of a sudden unaware of Canada again. We spent all this time during USMCA explaining the importance of the relationship, talking about how we can do things together. And 2 years later, the deal's done and nobody's talking about it. It's like, okay, we got the deal done and we're done with it and move on. Well, no, this is a country, it's such a big country in the world and such an important partner to us. You have to be basically down there all the time, re-educating, talking to them, looking for opportunities where you can do things together, where you can build things together, where you can do international policy that we reflect on and they reflect on and do those types of things together. And it can be military, it can be construction, it can be manufacturing, like supply chains. There's a variety of things. It can be even global aid, looking at those types of scenarios and looking for things that we can do together to just keep that relationship strong and close.
Yeah, and you make a good point. I know you've traveled the halls of Capitol Hill and the U.S. Congress, as well as around the White House. So how do we get onto the radar in D.C.? What should we be doing that we're not doing right now?
Well, what you don't do is you don't do silly things. And I'll give you a good example. We had a scenario during the COVID crisis where we weren't allowing any cruise ships to come into Canadian waters. Fair enough. The U.S. have a strange piece of legislation that they have to have their cruise ships go into foreign territory before they can go up the coast to Alaska. They asked for a quick tie down in Victoria or Vancouver. I can't remember which city it was. But basically what they want to do is come in, tie down. Nobody leaves the ship, but just tie down, then continue on down to Alaska and continue on with their summer cruise. We didn't return the phone call. We didn't even give them the consideration to say yes or no. We just didn't return the phone call. And it threw that whole cruise industry in a spiral for Alaska. So they found a way around it and did a workaround. And that workaround now could threaten our entire cruise ship industry in Victoria and Vancouver because we didn't return the phone calls.
Wow.
You have to pay attention when there's problems there. And they can't be just going to the US when you've got a problem. You can't just go down there and say, I've got a problem with potato works and PEI, or I've got a problem with electric vehicles. You also go down there and say, you know what, we've got a solution to help you out here. We've got examples of things we can do together that strengthen that relationship. Then all of a sudden, I think we're going to grab their attention and really make them realize how important of a partner we are. But when you ignore them or insult them, those are the types of things that happen.
Yeah, and we've got about a minute left, but it seems like we're we're just not even relevant right now. No one
No.
is even considering what the Canadian viewpoint or perspective is. Is that right?
No, I think that's fair to say, Tony. And you also got to remember they go into 2-year elections all the time. So you've got 1 year where a congressman's sitting there where you got a chance to talk to them. The next year they're into election cycle, so they, unless you're bringing them a check, they don't really want to talk to you. And then you've got a new flush of congressmen or women coming in every 2 years that you need to spend time with and educate on the importance of the relationship. So that has to be an ongoing factor. There's other items too, like our trade commissioners and people that are located throughout the U.S. I know the James Rajat is doing that now, opening up new offices for Alberta throughout the U.S. to do things like that, get more involved at local state level with those politicians too. So there's lots of work that needs to be done, and I'm going to work with my colleagues to start repairing that relationship from the Conservative perspective anyways, to make sure that we have a presence there and that when we get a Conservative government, we'll have people on the ground that know people on the ground in the U.S. and work together with them and look for the opportunities to improve that friendship and that partnership moving forward.
Randy Hoback, it's been great to have you on the program. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives on a host of issues. Wish you every success in your critic portfolio and hope to have you back soon. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it.
Lots to talk about there with Randy Hoback, Member of Parliament, about supply chains, some of the economic challenges that the country's facing with inflation as well. And yeah, as always, Canada-U.S. trade relations, they're never far from the surface. They affect pretty well everything. And Randy has a real understanding of that, having spent so much time in Washington, D.C. himself. So definitely an important topic or series of topics. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.